Now, for today's session, we're going to go through a few slides initially, just to cover off a bit of background about Avolution and our product ABACUS, and of course, focusing much more on here on the modeling aspects of ABACUS. And then what we'll also be doing is jumping into a live ABACUS environment to show you, of course, how some of that modeling work is actually done within the tool, within the solution. Before we do that, however, like I said, it is just worth going over. For those of you who know us, hopefully you know some of this information already. And of course, for those of you who are new to Avolution, Avolution is the company name, ABACUS is the product. And you can see here that we've been going for over 22 years now, essentially leading the market around enterprise architecture. Enterprise architecture, of course, is a relatively wide term to be used here. We have customers ranging from business process analysts to solution architects, all using some of the core features of ABACUS to actually deliver some of the work. So it's not always the case that we have pure enterprise architecture users. As you can imagine, that's scope-wide across most industries we work with, and of course, most of our customers as well. You'll also see that we have offices worldwide here. As I mentioned, we're speaking to you today from our London office, but any office in your local region you can reach out to, and the team, of course, will support you there as well. You'll also see that we also have thousands of users across the globe, and that's also backed up, hopefully, as you can see in the middle here, by the fact that we have various analyst reports positioning us as leaders as well in this particular market around enterprise architecture. We'll also be supporting many different frameworks and notations. And of course, that's going to be a topic that comes up quite a lot today. That could be methodology frameworks, things like TOGAF. It could be notational methodologies and frameworks like Archimate and BPMN, all the way to maybe more specific reference models and architectures like Accord and BIAN for the insurance and finance industry. There are over 100 of these supported out of the box. So the chances are that we do have a reference architecture or framework for your particular industry, but also keep in mind, and something you'll see later on towards the end of the slides, is that a lot of these maybe revolve around specific use cases that you're working on as well. We'd also highly encourage everyone to customize these frameworks. That's another part of what today's demonstration will cover, in the sense that if you even are aligned to something like TOGAF, the chances are you probably want to extend that, or maybe even just hide certain aspects from certain users. Again, something we'll be covering in much more detail later on. So for today's session, like I've mentioned, what we're really going to be looking at is modeling in enterprise architecture, of course, using ABACUS. We'll be looking at how to actually implement some of those architecture models. We'll be looking at some of the actual deliverables from those. And we'll cover off just finally with one case study very briefly, just to give you an example of what an existing customer of ours is already doing with ABACUS. And then if you wanted further case studies or references, of course, are all available on our website as well. Now, before we get into some of the main topics, I just want to cover off the product itself, ABACUS, in terms of how it's structured, simply because this is what we'll be going through later on during the live demonstration. And one of the things you'll notice here is that we effectively have two parts to ABACUS. We have ABACUS Studio and ABACUS Enterprise. ABACUS Studio really acts as the core tool initially. So this is going to be used for things like the configuration of the models, customizing frameworks, and also some of the administrative tasks around user management and managing things like algorithms and integrations. ABACUS Enterprise is really where we start branching off into the wider organization. So this is essentially a platform for anyone in the organization to consume the data that's within ABACUS. Typically, this is going to be through different types of visualizations and dashboards. And then we'll also be splitting these users across different profiles. So whether these users are going to have read-only access, whether they'll have editing access to be able to change some of the data sets, or from what you'll see today, modeling access to actually be able to start creating and editing some of the diagrams in ABACUS. Again, for those of you who've seen ABACUS before, hopefully this resonates. For those of you who haven't, of course, you'll be likely seeing the majority of Enterprise today. So if you did want a follow-up demonstration of ABACUS Studio, of course, please feel free to reach out to the team and we can look at organizing those demonstrations separately. Now, when we start thinking about modeling within architecture, one of the first things we tend to come across is usually solution architecture teams and how that really underpins some of the EA work that goes on within an organization. So this is going to be the first area that we look at. And it'll also be one of the areas that we cover during the actual live modeling session as well. So from a solution architecture space, what we're really looking at here is how solution architecture is developed across a number of different steps, really. And hopefully these are actually similar to any other domain that you're working in as well. But the idea is that we try to define some kind of problem or some kind of requirement statement. So this could be solving a particular issue within the organization, or even just developing entirely new solutions. That usually leads into some level of high level design down to low level design. This could be kind of HLD documents that you're bringing and building in ABACUS. And then finally, down to the implementation and deployment is how do we actually use that particular solution across the organization as well. And when we start looking at the design phase of this, one of the things to consider, of course, are the stakeholders who are involved. So, of course, we may have specific enterprise architects or domain architects building these types of blueprints, but we then may have technical architects looking at the low-level design as well. So when we start thinking about how ABACUS is going to be used across each of these areas, of course, it's important to know who the stakeholders are and who these design documents are going to be put in front of. Where enterprise architecture comes into play is essentially the fact that from an EA perspective, what we are really trying to do here is model, sometimes, not all the time, the entire stack within that organization, all the way from high-level business concept, so strategic operating models, projects and programs, through to data models and databases, typically around applications, technologies, and infrastructure, and then, of course, some level of ownership across some level of organization chart that you might want to build as well. So this meta model, this structure, is really how we're defining enterprise architecture within ABACUS. And the idea is that it then is suitable for defining and addressing multiple different domains, whether you are looking to build out business processes, whether you're building deployment views using Azure and AWS libraries, or if you're building strategic portfolios based off something like the business motivational model, all of these things can actually hang together in a single model. What you're actually seeing on the right-hand side is a rough implementation of the Avolution framework. This is actually a combination of other frameworks and notations, including things like TOGAF and ITIL and BPMN. And just like I said at the beginning, we'd always recommend trying to combine some of those notations together and using effectively a best practice model. If you do have TOGAF certified users and that's exactly what you want to use, of course, you could be using that straight out of the box as well. However, what we do also find is that there's likely going to be some level of customization, if not around the model itself, specifically around maybe the types of attributes or the properties that you want to be capturing as well. Again, we make that very easy in ABACUS. That can all be customized directly through the UI, and you have complete control over that too. So the next phase is actually trying to implement some of these architecture models within the solution. So like we mentioned before, the scope really here is around defining the meta model itself. And really what we're trying to look at is how do we actually define something like a current state within that particular architecture. From there, we typically narrow down that scope when we start looking at the specific data sets. So we might be creating kind of what if scenarios in the model and actually trying to decide on future states that we want to build. And then when we look at some of the design states that we go through, this is really trying to make use specifically maybe for solutions of deployments, deployment diagrams using some of the infrastructure notations that we have. We're trying to understand what patterns can be reused. Again, maybe TOGAF terminology in this case, things like ABB, so solution building blocks, and architecture building blocks. This is how we can actually start reusing some of that content across the model. A big part of ABACUS then, which isn't necessarily something we'll cover today, but hopefully if you want more information, we can send you some previous webinars we've done, is around actually analyzing that data set. So this is going to be things like cost estimations. We might want to understand the complexity of our model, the availability and reliability of our systems, customer satisfaction scores across processes and value streams. Analyzing that information, of course, is just as important as designing it. And that requires maybe specific algorithms or formulas, but could also be using specific data sets externally as well. So again, analyzing that information isn't necessarily what we'll be covering today, but of course, it's always going to be something that's taken into account when we're designing the views. And then finally, some kind of implementation to loop back those changes into the repository. So once we've designed a specific solution, let's say, we typically then want to iterate on that. We want feedback on that. And when that's actually, of course, in the wild, we want to understand how that's functioning as well. So it always comes back then to designing the scope again, looking at the data sets, and then designing and analyzing those changes going forward. I've mentioned solution architecture a few times, and it is worth maybe just highlighting, as you can see here, the types of notations that we'll be supporting out of the box for solution architects who are focusing on things like cloud architecture designs. So we do have the full AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud's GCP library out of the box. What this really does is it contains all of the notational elements, so these design artifacts that you can build. And of course, once these are built in ABACUS, that then means you can actually reuse these across other models as well. The important part of this, in terms of the wider modeling scope, is of course, each of these data elements are likely going to be connected up and down that repository. So monitoring things like dependencies and risks, calculating costs across these, calculating other metrics like technical debt scores. This is where all of these other modeling aspects feed into the wider EA team. Now, of course, it's not just cloud architecture designs that we'll be looking at today, but there are other aspects to consider around things like process optimization. So if we're designing specific processes or solutions in ABACUS, we might be starting from a relatively technical view. So looking at applications and infrastructure and building specific solutions for those. And then obviously we might be moving down into the actual process level. So how does a request for information access process work within the tool? The key thing here, especially on this particular view, is that actually when we start modeling these solutions or modeling existing processes or application interface views, what we're really doing is trying to provide a view of what today looks like. And then ideally what we're trying to do is design the future state. So in this case, we have a particular solution for a process that's using legacy platforms and relatively classical integrations that are happening behind the scenes. And one of the upgrade processes that we can think of is maybe moving to a SaaS platform where we can have API calls running across that data set. When we make these changes, the modeling aspect, of course, comes from the design changes and how that's affecting other parts of the organization. The analysis side then comes from the KPIs we're interested in. In this case, what does the overall complexity and maintenance scores look like after a redesign of a particular process? In this case, this probably isn't the case in real world situations, but we've lowered the complexity and lowered the maintenance. So clearly this is a solution that we'll likely want to go ahead with and be signing off. And this is, of course, initially down to the modeling that's gone on within the tool, actually redesigning some of these views. Now, when it comes to actually building deliverables for this content, there are two main ways that we've seen deliverables being produced, not just from ABACUS, but just generally across EA teams. The first is through live and interactive views. And this feeds nicely into, of course, the idea that we have ABACUS Enterprise, a live dashboarding environment. It's web-based. We can actually build portfolios of views in there that people can interact with daily. The benefit, of course, is that that's a live data set, which means it can be edited. We can actually apply filters and drill down through the data set to see all of that model at a high level or at a low level. The alternative, which we still have customers producing, is what we might call static or more formal views. More traditionally, these are kind of PDF or PowerPoint documents that are put together based on snapshots of the architecture or the repository. They have a very specific purpose, of course. They're still going to be needed in the future. But we do think that having more of a live interactive view has a few more benefits than a static kind of PDF view or PowerPoint slide deck. In saying that, to kind of bridge the gap, one of the kind of best practices that we try to advocate here is even if there is still a need to have these kind of file-based solutions being exported from ABACUS or being built manually outside of ABACUS, it's always nice maybe to add the links back into specific ABACUS Enterprise dashboard sites. That means you're giving your users two options, one that they can read statically and one that they can dive into for more detail later on and actually navigate through that data set themselves. Ultimately, what that does is it encompasses obviously the entire enterprise architecture repository. And regardless of whether we're building static or live environments to look at that data set, ideally, of course, we want that to be near real time, built off integrations, and making sure that it's accessible for everyone in the organization. So what we want to do now is actually walk you through the live environment, of course, and show you some of the modeling aspects in ABACUS and hopefully how that can be of benefit. Later on, we'll come back just to a couple more slides just to walk you through some business goals and an example case study. But for now, I will stop sharing my slides and we'll jump into ABACUS Enterprise. So ABACUS Enterprise, like I mentioned, is web-based. And what this does is it gives us the ability to produce different dashboards for different audiences. So traditionally, we may be building dashboards for specific roles or specific stakeholders. And the way dashboards are created is that they're essentially a collection of portlets or a collection of views. So when we start thinking about building these, we might want to be adding specific catalogs, so lists of information. We might want to display specific visualizations, so Gantt charts for our roadmaps, specific charts to highlight some of the attributes we're having to build in the model. Or we're looking at building and displaying specific diagrams in here. So of course, today's session is around modeling, so we'll be looking at building specific diagrams. Now, what you'll also see here are the various architectures or scenarios that I have modeled in ABACUS. This is purely just so we can jump into any of these if we want to look at the more detailed data sets behind the scenes. But for now, what we're going to be doing is just working in this as-is architecture. And we're going to start by actually creating a new diagram within this architecture. Now, when it comes to creating models within the tool, one of the first selection criteria we have is the type of viewpoint that we'd like to use. So coming back to frameworks like TOGAF or Archimate, they'll have specific viewpoints that they might recommend so that you can build specific models across that entire stack. So if we were building business capability maps, we might want to use that particular viewpoint. If we're building process diagrams or interface views, we might want to use those viewpoints. In our terminology, viewpoints do two main things. Firstly, they dictate the style of the diagram. So of course, if you have your own styles you want to use, you have a lot of options to use those out of the box or build your own. And the second thing they do is they control the rules within the model. So the governance and the standardization across these views becomes very important. It's also one of the reasons people tend to want to go for something like an EA tool, because traditionally they may have been using something like Visio, lots of flexibility, which inevitably means, in some cases, maybe not all, bad data quality. So anyone can build anything that they like in any way that they like, and there's no standardization across those views. This is, of course, the benefit of using something like ABACUS to actually build these. So for this particular one, we'll actually start with maybe a process diagram swim lane. And let's just call this our new process view. So we're going to be adding this within, as I said, our baseline architecture. And now I have this portlet that I can just resize just to make this a bit clearer. And you'll notice that I have two options to view and edit this particular view. That's because coming back to the types of users that we have within ABACUS Enterprise, read-only users would get access to all of this content. So of course, they would be able to see the information within the model. They would also be able to interact with all of that information as well. And then the second thing is the editor users will be able to change the data sets, but the modeler users will be able to actually edit these diagrams directly. So only the modeler users will be able to see this edit option. And of course, it's up to you as owners of ABACUS to decide who should have that capability and that level of permission. So let's go ahead and click on the edit option. And we'll see a few new things pop in. So we have the toolbar across the top. And now we can see the components and connections that we have available to build on this view. Again, I mentioned that second point of why viewpoints are useful. It's controlling the type of information that I can add onto this diagram. So for example, I can't add in things like infrastructure or servers or network elements, or projects or programs or strategic elements. I'm purely focused here on the fact that we can actually add in processes and capabilities. Now, for this particular view, we'll start off by dragging in an organization. And this is going to be added as a new organization into this particular diagram. And just make this clear, let's just maximize this view. So what we're essentially doing is dragging and dropping content from the stencil onto this canvas. We'll do the same thing for department. We'll add in the department swim lane in here. And again, this time we'll create this from scratch as a new swim lane. And again, we can resize this as well. Now, effectively what we're doing by dragging and dropping is, yes, we're drawing something on this canvas, but we're actually populating the repository behind the scenes as well. And you'll see how this becomes beneficial later on when we start creating other types of views. But we aren't necessarily just drawing, we're actually populating the entire model with this content. So let's just go ahead and create a few more things on here. So we'll create a new process. For this particular process, we might want to define a specific name for this, but you'll also notice on each of these elements, there are other aspects to consider. So for example, the style of these, the layouts, kind of pushing things to the back and bringing things to the front, all of these things can be utilized directly on these models. So for example, if I send this department to the back, then we can actually then see this process on the front level that we want to be able to access. Now, on this particular process, you'll also see a few call-out options, so these dynamic connector options. So I do have the option of not just connecting by pulling content from the stencil, but I can also drag and drop into a blank space to create connections to other parts of the repository. Now, again, this is why rules become quite effective. In our meta model, we've defined the components and the connections, so the objects and the relationships. And you can see in here, I can connect this process to a few different types of objects using specific connection types. In our model, we probably have over 30 different connection types to be used, but you can see ABACUS is only showing us one of those. That's because ABACUS has a context-aware system that's understanding the fact that these processes are connected to applications via a user's connection, because it's one of the rules that we've already set up in the model. And that's, again, another benefit of using some of the out-of-the-box frameworks and notations. Yes, you can customize those, but you don't necessarily have to. And you can use those on day one, straight out of the box, and start building these models instantly without having to worry about defining rules or concepts within the tool. So again, think of those frameworks almost as accelerators to some of the work that you want to be doing within the tool. Now, in this case, what we'll also do is we'll just add another new process in here. And then what we'll also show, of course, in this case, is that we can also connect to that process using, in this case, a sequence flow connection. So this is a starting point of starting to build some of these models in ABACUS. And this one, of course, a BPMN style view. Typically, you're going to be starting with start events and end events and decisions and gateways. For those of you who have a more detailed understanding of BPMN, you may notice that not all of the concepts are included in this particular stencil. Okay, we have the full BPMN library available out of the box. From our experience, and certainly how we've implemented this in our Avolution framework, we're simply just using the areas that we think are necessary to start building, not necessarily looking at things like intermediate and timer events in here. Of course, we have the top level ones, just not the low level ones within our particular Avolution framework. So if you did want to use that full model, of course, that's available out of the box. What I would also recommend, maybe specifically, I guess, in this case, because we're looking at something like BPMN, is if you had information in other tools. So if you wanted to import visual diagrams directly into ABACUS, import exports from things like Sparks, if you have a specific .bpmn XML format, those are all accepted formats to be pushed into ABACUS. And the benefit, of course, is once they're in here, let's say this was an imported view, I can still go ahead and start creating connections across the model to any other area that I want to build in here as well. So it's all managed directly in the system this way. Now, this screen that's just popped up is me trying to connect a process to an application. And I mentioned at the beginning, we're not necessarily going to be covering some of the analysis today, but what you will see quickly on here are the different types of properties that we have available to fill in on these applications. Now, for most of the time, we're actually connecting seamlessly without this window popping up until, for example, our team has organized this data set in a way that specifically says I have to fill in this field when I start adding in applications. So I need to make sure that I indicate that this application doesn't hold any customer confidential information, and now I can actually start creating that connection to the application. So again, the rules don't just govern the types of relationships and type of components, but you can also enforce some of these fields to make sure people are actually following that correctly. Behind the scenes in ABACUS as well, there is a validation engine. So of course, we're using something like BPMN in this case. So ABACUS will flag if we're maybe breaking one of those rules and we need to go in and actually make some changes and refine those. But all of that, of course, can be done in ABACUS Enterprise, or you could come back into ABACUS Studio to fix those up as well. For example, another team may be responsible for refining the processes. We might just be using this as almost like a whiteboarding exercise to draft something, but then it can be refined again later on. Now, for context, let's just rename some of these. So we've got new process 1 in here. So let's just call this process for adding users. And we can call this maybe a sign-up form. And they're all essentially, in this case, the process for adding users might be connected directly to our application. So let's say in this case, we have a new CRM system. So essentially naming some of these components in our model. And that means, of course, when other people want to start looking at this data set, that they have a bit more context around the type of content that we're building. But there is another reason for this as well. And so to highlight this, let's go ahead and create a new diagram in our as-is architecture. And let's say we call this our solution diagram. We're calling it a solution diagram, so let's go ahead and use the solution diagram stencil of viewpoints that we have available. Now, again, in exactly the same way, I can hit this edit option, and now I have my stencil available, except this time you'll see that ABACUS is giving us access to many more different component types and connection types that we can use in this particular model. And one of the benefits of coming into this type of view is that from a solution perspective, we can design connections across the entire model. The other key benefit of actually modeling in ABACUS isn't necessarily just to create things from scratch, like we just did for that particular process view, but it's also to actually start reusing content across the model. So let's do this once more. Let's drag in a new application. And if I was to type a name for this particular application at this stage, ABACUS is going to search the repository for existing data sets. So again, we're really just trying to promote the idea that we can reuse these components across the entire model. Let's say, for example, we want to add in this ERP HRM system. And for context, let's just take a look at the details of this application. Now, I'm adding this application into a model on this particular canvas that's existing in the entire architecture. So the first thing ABACUS is going to start showing me on this details page is the ERP system and all of its incoming and outgoing connections across the model. I can also then scroll down to see all of the other diagrams that this particular component appears on. Now, the reason this is beneficial, of course, is traditionally, if we were building Visio diagrams, reusing components across other teams' Visios is inherently quite difficult already. Even more difficult is then if an update has been made to one view, we have to manually go back and update others. The benefit here, of course, is that ERP system is a single object that's been reused across all of these views, including my new solution diagram. Therefore, changing the name or the properties or the connections is then going to automatically reflect across all of these other views as well. That's another useful thing if you come to maybe deleting content, or in this case, let's say retiring an application from the model. ABACUS will tell you all of the other views that it's going to be affecting. And of course, that's interesting because we may not necessarily know that that particular application is supporting specific capabilities or is tied to a specific supplier. So it's always good to look at these references to see all of those connections and then maybe drill down into a particular view to see that particular landscape. Now, again, from here, of course, we can go through many different options. If I drag this across, I can indicate that this particular application might be connected to a particular server. So it's maybe hosted on a particular server. Again, I could create this from scratch, or I could add in an existing one as well. In this case, again, we have a few values we need to fill in. We'll be quite vague for these particular ones. We'll just add in one for across these fields. And for all of these, keep in mind, we don't necessarily have to fill them in if the users haven't requested them. So of course, you can see there are many other attributes in here that we haven't filled in. It's only going to be these required ones. And in this case, I can also see that I need to set the parent for this particular server. This aspect of ABACUS is essentially how we can group our components and connections. It's essentially a way of building a hierarchy of information. So you can see in here, we have specific areas and countries and regions. And now I can actually choose a specific location for that server. Again, this is going to be one of the benefits of using something like ABACUS, is we can enforce some of these rules to make sure that when we create content, it sits in the right part of the organization. Specifically around applications and infrastructure, I'd probably just quickly emphasize that this data could be coming from external sources as well. So it's not always going to be the case that we create new things in ABACUS. We might be connecting to ServiceNow to bring this data into the tool, or via the API to bring this content in. And what we're really going to be doing in this case is actually just reusing that information. So again, these types of views are going to be really useful actually building out these types of models. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, you may also be building specific diagrams around specific solutions, let's say notations like Azure or AWS. So if we were to build a diagram in one of these architectures, you'll notice that we can use one of these existing viewpoints in exactly the same way we did for the solution views. And just like we would for those solutions, we can then see the full model notation that's available for us to start building all of these diagrams. Now, the benefit here, of course, is in the sense that we've created processes, applications, infrastructure, and we may now be completing some kind of deployment view in here. And the idea is that each of these elements are likely going to be connected up and down the model to each other. Those processes require applications. Those applications are hosted somewhere, and someone may want to drill down into that particular server to see the actual deployment view. And you can do this, of course, by creating these diagrams. But ultimately, what we get to is the ability to cascade these views across the architecture. And C4 is a good example of how this works. So C4 has a layered levels. So it has this context container components level, these are code level, hence the C4. And in this case, from a context level, if we take a look at this particular diagram, so this is, of course, one that's already been built in ABACUS. We have this context level for a particular actor. So in this case, a personal banking customer. There's relatively connections to different applications on here. And this particular application can then link down to level 2. So in this case, we're actually drilling down directly into the level 2 level of the C4 model to understand how the application links across to things like the API calls to other functional applications in that particular model. If we wanted to, we could then drill down into the specific web application in this case. And then we could actually take a look at that AWS library being built behind the scenes as a deployment view for that particular application. So this web application has specific connections to EC2 instances, maybe connecting to specific Lambda functions that you want to add in here. But all of that means there's context around that high level view down to this low level view. If I jump back a step, you also would have seen a link on the API application. And this then is just going to drill down further into that C4 model to see all the specific functional parts of that particular application. Now, again, the benefit of being in this view is that I can easily come in to edit this, even if it's a view that someone else has created. And I can add even more context onto this particular diagram, whether it's, again, creating connections across each of these areas, providing more detail about the databases these applications are interfacing with. All of that can be done directly through these modeling types of users in this particular dashboard. Now, another key thing I want to mention is when we start producing these types of views, typically we're adding a lot of stuff onto the diagram at one point in time. And of course, we might want to kind of move things around and adjust the layouts of these types of things. But ABACUS can also help in this instance with some of the layout options. So to highlight this, I'm just going to jump to a different dashboard site. And what we'll do is we'll open up this browser view. So there are two parts to ABACUS Enterprise. Dashboards allow us to build a collection of visualizations. A browser view allows us to focus on a particular view, whether that's a diagram, a matrix, or a catalog that we've built in this model. In this case, we have a capability map. This again has been produced in ABACUS by simply creating this model using our modeling license. And we could have laid this out in many different ways, but from a capability perspective, what we're really looking at is this kind of hierarchical layout, i.e. we have groupings within groupings, boxes within boxes, and that's going to be one of the best ways of laying out a diagram like this. Now, we may have other styles in here as well. So let's take maybe a more data-centered view. If we look at our information models and we look at the information architecture, in this case, we have databases, data entities, and data fields. And we can play around with these layout options and to see which one would actually suit us best. So of course, ABACUS is going to try its best to lay things out. You may not necessarily always prefer the outcome of those layouts. You still have the ability to manually change this, but this can definitely speed up the work of building these diagrams, laying them out automatically, and then in the future making some minor adjustments to them. This is again the main benefit of being in this modeling environment. We're not just drawing things, we're actually providing these layout options so that you don't have to spend your time manually adjusting every single arrow or component on these views. You can actually use these layout options across that model. If you have significantly larger models, what we would also suggest is actually just selecting the parts that you want to lay out, and you could also then choose one of those layout methods as listed above. So we don't have to lay out everything on this view, we can just lay out specific parts of that diagram as well. Now, once we start building these models in ABACUS, typically, of course, as we start drawing these things, we typically want to be given access to everyone else. And I mentioned at the beginning that anyone can have access to these views, typically based off single sign-on. We're usually going to be applying a permissions model in here. But as you can see, if users are navigating through this data set, they may not always know where to look for that particular model. And that's why, again, we'd always encourage searching the entire repository. Let's say, for example, I want to find information about our CRM system, and I can see that someone's actually already built a solution for our CRM system. And I can see it exists both as our as-is architecture, and someone's also created some kind of target state for what they want that to look like. But for now, I'm just interested in the current solution for CRM because I want to understand the entire context for that particular application. And in this case, I can see the relationships it has to different services and projects, all the way through to things like technologies and infrastructure. And the benefit of this being modeled in this way is now I know everything that's going to be impacted if we decide to retire the CRM system, or if this CRM system was potentially offline one day. As a contingency plan, I may want to look at adding new content to this view. So for example, it's already using specific technologies in here, but I may want to indicate that we want to migrate to a newer technology. Now, typically we'll be using a better name than this, but we can add that technology onto the landscape, and then someone can go in and actually validate those changes and see that we actually want to be investing in this new technology to support this application because we've realized that potentially these are reaching end of vendor support. And of course, we need to look at migrating this application onto a new tech stack. So that modeling environment, of course, wouldn't be possible if we didn't have this view being built for us. And the idea that we can actually customize this means we can actually contribute to this model as well. Quite often I've seen I guess maybe Visio specifically, as much as it is maybe a free-for-all for everyone, a lot of those views do tend to be a bit more locked down, so users can't edit those. Of course, we can decide to do that in ABACUS or a permissions model, but you really want to be treating this as an environment that users can contribute to. And not just in the sense of adding anything to any view, but passing that through a workflow approval phase. Maybe we have different scenarios or architectures to manage those types of workflows, to make sure the change is getting approved across the model. All of that, of course, can be managed in here as well. But the main idea from a modeling perspective is to come into somewhere like ABACUS Enterprise, give access to build things from scratch and edit existing diagrams, and then give users the option to search through that model. One final thing I'll say while we're in ABACUS Enterprise as well is you can see this is web-based, and you can also see that each specific view has a unique URL. One of the biggest wins that we've seen across customer sites is not just allowing users to access these sites directly, but embedding these in something like a Teams channel or a Teams chat. And that means that that live view is always going to be available within that channel. The additional benefit of that is it's not just a snapshot of the view. Because it's live, users also have this editing capability then directly within Teams. So this view could be in a Teams channel, we could be on a call discussing this, and we could have multiple people actually editing this view or editing the data sets within the portfolio. So putting these views into an environment that users are already accessing, Teams, Confluence, any other intranet site you have, again, is maybe a quick best practice for kind of lowering the barrier to entry for some users and making sure that that's accessible, of course, for everyone who wants to see that information. Now, we have maybe 15 minutes or so left, and as usual, time flies on these types of calls. So if you want more detailed information and access to an environment to play around with this modeling aspect of ABACUS Enterprise, feel free to reach out. We can take you through more details of this and give you an environment where you have access to all of the data I've shown today and to be able to model with this directly. Just quickly, though, I do just want to cover off 2 more slides before we jump into a Q&A. So far, I've talked about the modeling aspects, and I've talked around things like business processes, capabilities, solution architecture views, various aspects of an organization that covers various different domains. One of the big things we always advocate at the beginning for any of our customers is to try to identify specific business goals or what we might call use cases. And there's a few reasons for this. The first is each use case may have its unique take on a particular notation or architecture framework. So if we're going down the cloud migration route, we might want to be leveraging some of the cloud migration AWS, Azure, GCP library icons so that we can actually build those views appropriately. If we're looking at something like a cybersecurity model, then when we come to modeling that specific situation, again, we might want to use specific reference models. We might want to use TOGAF, but very likely we might want to use NIST and SABSA to actually specifically support that scenario. And again, when it comes to maybe some of the road mapping or the innovation aspects of the model, we might be looking at more kind of high-level strategic frameworks and notations, business modeling canvas, the business motivational model, all the way through to specific areas like BizBook for capability modeling. And of course, that feeds into the wider organization as well. If you're unsure about these areas, again, it's something we can help with. We can provide some best practices. We have combined specific frameworks for these use cases and challenges and goals that customers are trying to achieve. So we can always direct you in the right direction as to the modeling aspects you want to use. And of course, how to analyze that information later on. And then finally, this is just a very quick case study. I won't go through all the details in here, but the reason I pulled this specific one up, and you'll find many more on our site as well, and many more through things like our digital summit, which I'm sure the marketing will reach out to you all again soon because we have another upcoming digital summit this year with a few interesting guests already lined up. But this particular case study actually specifically focuses on KLP's instance of being able to actually model things in ABACUS. And you'll see in the bottom right here, the idea that they're creating diagrams to actually tell a story. So it isn't a case that they're building views for a very particular domain. In their instance, when they were looking at levels of compliance and regulation across their organization, yes, it is important to know where that data was, but to them, those diagrams told a story of who accesses that data, where is it stored, which applications use it, are any external suppliers having access to that? Does that data support our overall capabilities and services we offer our customers? And that made the story much more complex within that particular portfolio. So lists of information, specific visualizations could be beneficial, but the modeling aspect of ABACUS was significant because they could constantly change those models, constantly have feedback and input from other users, and there was always a live view of what that situation looked like, especially when it came to potentially audits or exports they needed to perform in ABACUS. That became their single source of truth for looking at that particular story around GDPR compliance. And again, many customers have used ABACUS for this particular scenario, and of course, then added on top of that when they have other use cases or other teams coming on board as well. Now, that was the final slide, and I have promised that we'll go to the Q&A to make sure that we can get through as many questions as possible in the time that we have remaining. So actually, I'll cover just a few of the quick ones because they're quick answers, which I'm going to duck out of answering and direct you to someone else. But we've had a couple of questions around pricing here for specific team sizes and general pricing as well on licensing. If you want more information on this, just get in contact with myself. I can direct you to your closest sales team or regional team, and they can give you a bit more information about the licensing model and the costs. What I will quickly say is at the beginning, I mentioned there are two products, ABACUS Studio and ABACUS Enterprise. The packages that we offer contain both of those parts. We feel that they are both fundamental aspects of an EA team. Studio gives you more flexibility around the configuration of the tool. ABACUS Enterprise, like you've seen so far, gives you access to some of the modeling capabilities. You still have modeling capabilities in Studio as well, but specifically just for those who want to draw diagrams, ABACUS Enterprise modelers become very useful. ABACUS Enterprise editors give access to changing specific properties. And then ABACUS Enterprise read-only users, as mentioned, you can kind of think of that as a kind of like a free unlimited license that anyone in the organization can access those data sets. There are nuances to that, of course. So please feel free to reach out and we can give you an explanation of how we might think your user sits into those categories. And after maybe a trial period of ABACUS, you may come to similar conclusions as well as to how your users would actually be interacting with ABACUS as well. Okay, so another question we have in here. So I guess maybe because I've mentioned whiteboarding as well. So yeah, about whiteboarding, can we save a temporary in draft mode? So for example, they might just want to save things in draft because they don't necessarily want people to see those. One of the best ways of doing that is to effectively use the architectures in ABACUS. So earlier on, you would have seen we had the as-is, the C4, the AWS and Azure architectures. They are essentially just ways of modeling specific scenarios. Customers might use those to model specific years, and some customers use those to model specific workflows. In this case, having some kind of staging architecture where all the draft modeling happens, and then promoting that to be in the production or live or as-is environment is one way of managing those drafts. The other way is to actually build a specific draft folder within one architecture and simply save those diagrams in there. Keep in mind, the main idea here is that we're applying a permissions model across that draft folder and across that particular architecture, i.e., some users can't see those diagrams, some users can see them but not edit them, and some users can see them and edit them. So that's the level of granularity that we can get to from a permissions model down to the draft folder level, up to the architecture level, and even across individual views and individual properties as well. We can work those permissions. But specifically for that answer, for temporary diagrams in draft mode, save those into a draft folder. And of course, if you are a customer, reach out to the consulting team, and of course, they can walk you through that to see what that looks like as well. Another question was, if we embed this into Teams, can anyone change the layouts directly? And does it automatically save? So the layout options in terms of changing them is only going to be accessible to those modeler users. So if they have modeling access, they can go through that particular layout change. And also any diagrams in ABACUS in terms of any changes in ABACUS Enterprise Modeler does automatically save directly in that model as well. You then also have ABACUS automatically committing those change, which means everyone can see those after a certain period of time. So again, going back to the draft question, you may want to set those in draft mode until they become live. Another question here was maybe a bit more about the analysis. So certainly after today's session, when we send the recording around, and we may also just try to include a few more sessions we've done in the past, but I'd highly recommend taking a look at the site and our YouTube channel to take a look at the previous webinars we've done, because that one does specifically answer this question around how we can look at the budgetary impact, so impact analysis on costs for 2B scenarios. Again, I'd highly recommend looking at those previous WebExes. What I would quickly say is when we come to building some kind of cost model in ABACUS, one of the ways that we typically want to do that is going to be through a dashboarding environment. Analyzing and understanding those costs, of course, can be running in ABACUS through an algorithm. But what I would suggest is building some kind of trade-off dashboard, where if we are looking specifically at costs, we might want to do some kind of comparison of the as-is and to-be states. So in this case, indicating how those costs have reduced over time. And in here, you obviously can see a few more capability KPIs that we have. So the availability of our systems, the complexity, etc. That type of impact analysis is useful as a side-by-side comparison. The actual analysis of that, I would recommend looking at the algorithms and some of the cost and financial simulations that we have out of the box. That can be really useful for understanding budgets across projects and programs and how they can be allocated across the model as well. So another question around the Teams integration around cost. So what I would say is for the Teams integration, no, it's not an additional cost. What we're essentially doing is embedding that enterprise site into a Teams channel via the URL of that enterprise site. What you'll also find, however, there are some integrations in ABACUS already. So for example, if you wanted to start a conversation with someone and they have an email address in one of the fields in ABACUS, you can just click on that name and it'll open up a Teams chat or what other kind of chat application you're using to speak to your employees internally. But that will work directly, and that's not an added integration. And hopefully what you'll also see in the future are further integrations to things like Teams as well. So right now, embedding enterprise, again, is quite a big win for a number of different customers, but you could also use that chat function to start a conversation with those people directly from ABACUS, and that will just open up the Teams chat with that particular person. Like I said, that's dependent on just having the URL in the field, the email address in the field. But typically that's going to be quite common, especially if you want to capture ownership across data sets, application owners, process owners. We'd always try to advocate having that type of information in there as well. Thank you very much.